It's definitely not the story of Fred. It's okay. So this is about FREED, which is a novel early intervention service which we have set up in the Eating Disorders Unit. And I will say a bit about why and how we did this and tell you a bit about some of the emerging impacts. So this work started exactly 5 years ago, and at the time we were really very concerned about how long our patients had to wait before we could see them, often many months. And we were particularly concerned about the effect this had on our younger patients, who would often come with their very first episode of an eating disorder, who had never had any treatment before. These would be young people aged 18, 19, 20. They would perhaps still be at school, had just started uni. Perhaps they had just left home for the very first time. They were pretty clueless usually about the NHS. They were very ambivalent about coming to see us. And many months later, when they finally got to us, they were very distressed and often had significantly deteriorated. So a big concern. We were not the only people concerned about this. There was a lot in the media at the time about eating disorder patients having very lengthy waits up and down the country. And there were also some very notable cases, like this one here of Averil Hart, who died, young people with anorexia whose eating disorder wasn't picked up early enough, or their deterioration went unnoticed. And it's a sobering reminder of the fact that anorexia has one of the highest mortality rates of any psychiatric disorder. In parallel, there were data coming out about hospital admission rates for eating disorders, time trend data. And what you can see, these data go back to the 1960s. Between the 1960s and about the early 2000s, hospital admission rates for eating disorders were very stable, and then they gradually go up, whichever way you look at that. Now, importantly, the greatest rise was in young people aged 15 to 19. That's the peak, the time of peak onset of eating disorders. And it's also the time when people usually come with their first episode. And the context we need to consider is that, of course, during this time, admissions for most other psychiatric disorders were declining. So we really thought we need to do something about this. We want to get in there earlier. And there was nothing in eating disorders to really show us the way. So we looked towards our colleagues in psychosis, who at that point already had sort of 20 years experience of doing early intervention, of devising stage models of illness. And of course, in psychosis, as you all know, these models center around the idea that you want to shorten duration of untreated illness from first onset of symptoms to start of evidence-based treatment to prevent functional decline and increase probability of recovery. And really, by keeping this interval short, you try to prevent neuroprogression that sort of is associated with brain changes that keep you locked into the illness. And this has all been very, very influential. So we wanted to know, can we apply this to eating disorders? Do we have something like early stage illness in eating disorders where people have a different, better prognosis? And the answer is yes. If you get in there within the first 3 years, we know this from clinical studies, you get much better outcomes. But the really shocking thing is that actually it's been known for 160 years, since eating disorders were first described, that early intervention matters. Only nobody did very much about it. So I thought I'd show you some quotes. Here on the top left, Charles Lassagne, he said, "Woe to the physician who, misunderstanding the peril of anorexia, treats it as a fancy without object or duration." So in other words, don't ignore it, don't wait for it to sort itself out, get in there early. And Charcot, a contemporary of his, said, "Persuade the parents to undertake energetic measures at the beginning and not wait until the illness has taken deep root." Now, and the man from down the road, where I was just examining Oskis at Guy's, William Gull, I think a rather pompous fellow who was the physician to the Queen, said, early active intervention with regular nourishing foods, application of warmth and control of restless activity, plus a dessert spoon of brandy. We do all of these things except the brandy. Now we give people olanzapine instead. Now, what these guys didn't know, of course, was about the underlying neurobiological changes that contribute to keep making eating disorders more entrenched. And here are some data from a very influential study from the Columbia Group, Joanna Steinglass. They developed this very nice food choice task where they show people endless plates of foods, high and low calorie, and get them to rate them for tastiness and healthiness. And in a second step, they get people to make choices between two different types of foods. Now, they have set this task up in such a way that they can take people in the scanner, and people with anorexia, when having to make these food choices, engage their dorsal striatum much more than healthy controls. And what also is the case is that in anorexia, activity in frontostriatal circuits when making food choices is correlated with food consumption the following day. So it's a highly ecologically valid task. Now, the dorsal striatum has a critical role in learned automatic behaviors. So the central thesis of these authors is that food choices in anorexia become like a bad habit, so that they always go for the crudités over the high-calorie donuts. And that becomes very hard to shift over time. I'll give you one other little example from a study that we have done recently, which is sort of a bit along similar lines. And this is a study on attention to food stimuli. And we looked at people in the very early stages of anorexia, very short illness duration, about a year, and compared them to people with established anorexia, and then did eye tracking. And you can see people were presented always with these lovely stimulus pairs, one food, one non-food, and high and low calorie. Now, what happens when most of us look at such a stimulus pair is we initially immediately look towards the food. We might then go towards the non-food item, but we usually come back to the food. That's what's rewarding to us as non-eating disordered people. If you look on the right, you can see people with early stage anorexia tend to behave exactly as people, healthy people without an eating disorder. They look at the food and keep their gaze mainly on the food. In contrast, people with established, long-standing anorexia tend to gaze away from the food after initially briefly looking towards it. And this effect is even stronger if you just consider high-calorie foods. So in conclusion, in anorexia, an attentional bias away from food develops over time, making it easier not to eat. And there are lots and lots of other studies coming out now which are beginning to look at the different illness phases and how the illness becomes more entrenched over time. I haven't got time to explain all that. So instead, I thought I'd go back to what in psychosis early intervention is a key sort of feature, thinking about duration of untreated illness. What's duration of untreated eating disorders like? And we did a systematic review of this recently, and as you can see, most of the studies have been done in anorexia nervosa, and the average duration of untreated anorexia is 32 months. You can see there's a lot of variability. The studies with the shorter illness duration are mainly highly specialized inpatient units. You get people who come with the first episode who have deteriorated very rapidly. But studies that look more at the whole breadth of severity find these much longer illness durations. And you can also see that people with other eating disorder diagnoses, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorders, and so on, wait much, much longer to the point of their first treatment. And so all of these different things we took into account in developing FREED, our first episode early intervention service. We designed this for young people aged 16 to 25 with a recent onset eating disorder. And we wanted to provide developmentally and stage appropriate care for them. The aims were to reduce duration of untreated eating disorder and improve outcomes. And I've indicated this here with a picture of synchronized swimming to say that we were really keen to provide highly coordinated care that was person-centered, that was reaching out to young people who were anxious and ambivalent, where we would give young people psychoeducation about the malleability of brain and other biological changes early on in the illness, and where we have developed a lot of different resources for patients, carers, and professionals wanting to use this sort of service model that's tweaked to the needs of these young first episode cases. And here are just a couple of our resources on the brain and eating disorders, and also on preparing for university, and there's loads more on our website. Now we've done two studies on FREED, two quasi-experimental pre-post studies, a pilot just done at SLAM, and a scaling up study, which was a multi-center study. And we had quite a few aims, but mainly they focused around effectiveness. What we wanted to know is, compared to how we previously treated young people with similar eating disorders, is FREED able to improve duration of untreated eating disorders and waiting times? Is it able to improve treatment uptake and adherence, clinical outcomes? Is it cost effective? And what are the views of stakeholders on it? And finally, we are also interested in fidelity. And along the side are the four incredibly talented researchers who sort of led this work: Jess McClellan, Katie Lang, Michaela Flynn, and Millie Austin, all of whom are currently doing their PhD here, or having done their PhD are now doing their DCLIN Psych training here. So here are some of our findings. Firstly, looking at duration of untreated eating disorders. And I'm showing you first our pilot data in 140 patients, and then FREED up in 500 patients. And you can see that in both cases, the introduction of this service level intervention dramatically reduces duration of untreated eating disorders. And in a very similar way in both cohorts, about 5.5 to 6 months. And this is a highly significant difference. But the really important question is, of course, what about the clinical outcomes? And here I have data from the pilot study. So firstly, just to set a bit of the scene, we had much improved treatment uptake. 100% of people offered treatment within FREED took it up versus about 70% previously. 70% of people who were offered FREED no longer had an eating disorder diagnosis at 12 months. And the need for inpatient treatment, which is very costly in eating disorders because it's long, was reduced by 35%. But the real sort of showstopper of a result for me is the body mass index outcomes in anorexia nervosa. And let me just talk you through this here. What you can see in the top graph is the patients who had FREED. So they had a rapid assessment and started treatment very quickly. And they start improving between assessment and treatment. And then off they go, and at 24 months, their body mass index is back to normal. In contrast, the treatment as usual patients already at assessment are a bit lower in weight. And the reason for that is they have waited to get to the first assessment. They then wait a long time to start treatment and deteriorate. And then they sort of do quite all right in psychotherapy, but actually they never catch up with the others. And by the 2-year follow-up, the difference is just under 1 stone, which is a really big difference in weight. Weight is not everything, but it's strongly associated with well-being and quality of life and good outcome. So if you prefer to look at this in terms of sort of categorical outcomes, 59% of freed anorexia versus 18% of tau patients, treatment as usual patients, achieved BMI recovery. So a big difference. Okay, so conclusions and next steps. I don't know what's happened with my slides. They must have been manked up slightly. The freed up clinical outcomes, of course, aren't available yet at the moment. So we are sitting here with a bated breath, really waiting for our outcomes in the big study of 500 patients. We will know this summer whether we have been able to replicate the findings from the pilot. But for the duration of untreated eating disorder, there is high replicability between the pilot and the larger study. So freed is scalable. The elephant in the room, of course, is that we would need to and would want to shorten duration of untreated eating disorder further. For example, by reducing barriers to accessing care. And this can only happen if there is a change in policy. In the meantime, we have been awarded an NHS Innovation Accelerator Grant, which is led by my colleague, Karina Allen, and we've been able to disseminate freed further. So this slide shows where we started in red. There's one eating disorder service, the service at SLAM, and the sort of cream color is where we are hoping to be next year in 2020. The dark blue is where we were at the end of last year. So you can see we've scaled this up from 1 to 8 services. We've gone from 7 to 22 clinical commissioning groups. Our population reach in millions of people is gone from 2 to 10 million. And in terms of the percentage of the population of England, we now reach 18%. And we hope to be at 45% by 2020. And by then we will be over the tipping point where after diffusion of this innovation will become easier. So to go the full way towards making this a national model, we of course need impact on policy. And we're making some inroads there. Freed has been cited as a good practice example in the forthcoming NHS England commissioning guide for adult eating disorders, and it will also appear in the forthcoming Royal College position statement on early intervention. And so these are first steps getting a sort of toehold into sort of policy documents. Finally, we're using freed as a springboard for further research. Millie Austin here on the left has just got an international PhD studentship, and in collaboration with Jerome Breen, she will look at polygenic risk scores and illness trajectories in first episode cases. And in the middle, Savani Bartoldi and Lauren Robinson, in collaboration with Sylvain de Rivière, are looking at biomarkers of illness onset and maintenance, both in Imagen, in the Imagen cohort, and in a separately collected cohort of young adults with eating disorders. And last but not least, Rachel Potterton, who's a BRC PhD student, is looking at the trials and tribulations of being an emerging adult and what that means for help seeking and in terms of your sort of psychosocial adjustment. And this is done in collaboration with Tyrrell Harris and Vanessa Lawrence. And my very final thanks goes to all the amazing clinicians that have been involved in this work, our team at SLAM, without whom none of this could have happened, and our fantastic partner sites. And you can see we had quite a lot of fun along the way. Thank you.